"Move aside, sir. The engineers are handling it." The words were sharp enough to stop most people in their tracks. But Ethan Carter simply nodded, stepped back, and adjusted the worn work gloves hanging from his belt. He had heard versions of that sentence before. Different places, different faces. Same assumption. The massive manufacturing facility outside Phoenix, Arizona, buzzed with tension beneath the afternoon sun. Delivery trucks lined the loading docks. Managers hurried across the concrete walkways with tablets in their hands. Workers stood in small groups, whispering nervously. Somewhere deep inside the building, a machine worth millions of dollars had stopped working. And according to the rumors spreading through the factory, nobody knew why. Ethan parked his aging pickup near the receiving area and climbed out carrying a small shipment of replacement components ordered weeks earlier. It should have been a simple delivery. 10 minutes at most. Sign the paperwork. Drop off the boxes. Head home in time to make dinner for his daughter. Instead, the moment he approached the entrance, he noticed something was wrong. People were moving too fast, talking too loudly, looking too worried. A supervisor rushed past him while speaking into a headset. Two technicians argued beside a service cart. Near the main production floor, a group of executives stood together with expressions that suggested every passing minute was costing money. Ethan handed over the delivery paperwork. The receiving clerk barely glanced at it. "Leave the boxes there." Ethan nodded. "Busy day?" The clerk laughed without humor. "You have no idea." He lowered his voice. "Main production system went down this morning." Ethan looked toward the factory floor. "Still down. 8 hours." The clerk shook his head. 40 engineers here, and nobody has figured it out." Ethan raised an eyebrow. 8 hours was a long time, especially for a facility like this. Through the open doorway, he could see workers standing beside idle equipment. Conveyor systems sat motionless. Indicator lights flashed across control panels. The entire building felt like a giant machine holding its breath. A few moments later, another group entered through the main doors. Engineers, consultants, specialists. Their company logos and credentials seemed to announce expertise before they even spoke. Yet none of them looked confident. Most looked frustrated. One looked exhausted. Ethan quietly watched while signing the final delivery form. Then something unusual caught his attention. Not a visual detail. A sound. Faint. Almost hidden beneath the noise of conversations and ventilation systems. He tilted his head slightly. Listened. The sound disappeared. Then returned. A brief metallic rhythm. Subtle. Easy to miss. Ethan frowned. The receiving clerk noticed. "Everything okay?" Ethan looked toward the production area. "What machine failed?" The clerk pointed toward the center of the building. "That one." Ethan listened again. There it was. The same sound. Short. Repeating. Strange. Not loud enough to attract attention, but strange enough that he remembered hearing something similar years earlier. Before he could think further, a manager approached. "Sir, this area is restricted right now." Ethan nodded politely. "Of course. We have technical teams working." "Understood." The manager relaxed slightly. Most people argued when told to stay back. Ethan never did. He simply stepped aside and waited. From where he stood, he could see dozens of professionals surrounding the disabled system. Screens displayed diagnostic information. Technicians reviewed data logs. Engineers pointed toward different sections while debating possible causes. Yet despite all the activity, nothing moved. The machine remained silent. Ethan glanced at his watch. Every minute that passed seemed to increase the pressure inside the building. Executives paced. Supervisors checked schedules. Employees exchanged worried looks. The atmosphere felt heavy. Then the strange sound appeared again. Brief. Metallic. Almost like a whisper hidden inside the machinery. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Something about it bothered him. Not because he knew the answer. Not yet. Because he suspected everyone might be looking in the wrong place. He listened one more time. The sound came again. Short. Precise. Familiar. And as 40 experts continued searching for a solution, the single father delivering a box of parts suddenly found himself wondering a question nobody else seemed to be asking. The question stayed in Ethan Carter's mind long after the strange metallic sound faded away. Around him, the factory continued operating in a state of controlled panic. Managers rushed between departments. Engineers gathered around screens filled with diagnostics. Consultants reviewed reports and technical diagrams. Everyone seemed busy. Everyone seemed intelligent. Yet the machine remained silent. Ethan picked up his empty delivery cart and headed toward the exit. That should have been the end of it. Delivery completed. Paperwork signed. Time to go home. But as he passed the production floor one final time, the sound returned. Click. A brief pause. Click. Ethan stopped walking. The rhythm was subtle, almost hidden beneath the voices and ventilation fans. Most people would never notice it. Yet something about it felt familiar. He glanced toward the disabled system. The machine itself was enormous, stretching nearly the length of a basketball court. Conveyor sections connected to robotic stations. Automated sensors lined the assembly path. Indicator lights blinked across multiple control cabinets. It looked less like one machine and more like several machines working together as one. Near the center platform, a senior engineer stood addressing a group of specialists. "We have already tested the control network." Another engineer nodded. "No communication faults detected." A third crossed his arms. "Power systems? Stable. Software? No critical errors." Ethan listened quietly from a distance. One possibility after another was being eliminated, yet the machine still would not run. The strange sound appeared again. Click, click. Ethan frowned. A receiving clerk noticed him standing there. "Still here?" Ethan smiled. "Just heading out." The clerk followed his gaze toward the production line. "Crazy day. Seems that way." The clerk lowered his voice. "They brought in experts from 3 different states." Ethan looked surprised. "Really? Costs a fortune every hour that machine sits idle." Ethan nodded slowly. He believed it. Facilities like this depended on efficiency. Delays rippled through schedules, contracts, and production targets. Every lost hour mattered. Across the floor, another group joined the discussion. More engineers, more analysis, more theories. Yet despite the growing number of experts, nobody appeared any closer to solving the problem. Ethan turned toward the exit again, then stopped. The sound had returned. Click. He listened carefully. This time he noticed something else. The timing. The sound did not appear randomly. It followed a pattern. Small. Consistent. Repeating. A memory surfaced from years earlier. Different machine. Different building. Similar symptom. Ethan stared toward the production system. His expression tightened slightly. Then he shook his head. It could not be that simple. Or could it? Before he could decide, a woman in a dark business suit entered the production area. Conversations immediately shifted. Supervisors straightened. Managers moved aside. Engineers stopped talking. The woman carried herself with calm authority. Ethan did not know her name, but he immediately recognized her role. Leadership. The person responsible for everything happening inside the building. She listened to a brief update from several department heads. None of the news appeared encouraging. One engineer pointed toward diagnostic reports. Another discussed testing procedures. A third reviewed projected losses if the outage continued overnight. The woman remained calm, but concern showed briefly in her eyes. Ethan watched for a moment. Then the strange sound appeared again. Click. The woman looked toward the machine. Nobody else seemed to react. Ethan finally approached the receiving clerk. "Can I ask something?" "Sure." Ethan nodded toward the production line. "Has anyone checked the synchronization relay sequence?" The clerk blinked. "The what?" Ethan smiled. "Never mind." Unfortunately, the question had been overheard. One nearby technician looked at Ethan. "You work on systems like this?" Ethan shook his head politely. "Not this exact model." Another technician laughed. "Then I think 40 engineers have it covered." Several nearby workers smiled. The comment was not cruel, just dismissive. The assumption seemed obvious to them. Delivery driver. Work gloves. Pickup truck. No company badge. Certainly not someone qualified to offer technical insight. Ethan simply nodded. "You are probably right." The technicians returned to their conversation. Ethan made no effort to argue. No effort to explain. No effort to prove anything. That was not his nature. Yet as he started walking toward the parking lot, the machine produced the same strange sound once more. Click. Ethan stopped, turned, and quietly asked himself the same question nobody else seemed willing to ask. If that sound was normal, why did it only appear when the system failed? The parking lot should have been the end of Ethan Carter's day. His delivery was complete. His paperwork was finished. His daughter would be expecting him home before sunset. Yet he remained seated inside his aging pickup truck, looking through the windshield toward the massive factory. The strange sound still lingered in his thoughts. Click. Pause. Click. Simple, consistent, familiar. He started the engine, then stopped. Something about the situation refused to leave him alone. Across the lot, emergency lighting glowed inside the facility as teams continued working. The production line had now been down for most of the day. 40 engineers, consultants from multiple states, senior specialists, entire teams of experts. Yet the machine remained silent. Ethan glanced at the clock. Another 20 minutes passed. Then another 10. Finally he sighed, turned off the engine, and stepped back out of the truck. Not because he thought he had the answer. Because curiosity had become impossible to ignore. Inside the building, the atmosphere had grown even more tense. New diagnostic stations had been assembled. Additional equipment surrounded the disabled system. Whiteboards filled with notes stood near control panels. Engineers moved quickly between workstations carrying laptops and reports. Yet despite all the activity, progress seemed non-existent. Ethan walked toward the receiving area where the clerk still sat reviewing paperwork. "You are still here?" the clerk asked. Ethan smiled. "Apparently." The clerk laughed. "You and everyone else. Nobody wants to leave until they see what happens." Ethan looked toward the production floor. "Any breakthroughs?" "Not one." The clerk shook his head. "Every theory falls apart." Ethan nodded slowly. Nearby, a heated technical discussion unfolded between several senior engineers. One pointed toward sensor readings. Another referenced software logs. A third argued that the issue had to involve a synchronization failure somewhere inside the system. None sounded confident. The woman in the dark business suit remained present as well. She moved calmly through the facility, speaking with department heads and reviewing updates. Despite the growing pressure, she never raised her voice. Yet concern showed in small ways. A brief pause before speaking. A thoughtful look toward the silent machine. A glance at the clock. Every lost minute carried consequences. Ethan found himself watching the production system again. Then the sound returned. Click. His eyes narrowed immediately. A technician walking nearby noticed. "What are you looking at?" Ethan hesitated. "Can I ask a question?" The technician shrugged. "Sure." Ethan pointed toward the machine. "Has anyone traced where that clicking sound is coming from?" The technician blinked. "What clicking sound?" "Right on cue. It happened again." Click. The technician listened, then shrugged. "Probably nothing important." Ethan nodded politely. "Maybe." The technician walked away. Yet the response only increased Ethan's curiosity. Because the sound did not seem random. It sounded mechanical, intentional, like a component repeatedly attempting to do something it could not complete. Across the floor, another team gathered around a control cabinet. More discussion, more analysis, more theories. Hours of expertise continued producing no answers. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan overheard part of a conversation between two senior engineers. "We have tested every major subsystem. Twice. Then why does it still fail?" Neither man had an answer. Ethan looked back toward the machine. The same question echoed through his own mind. Why? Sometimes complicated failures had complicated causes, but not always. Sometimes the smallest detail created the largest problem. A loose connection, a stuck relay, a failed switch, a simple issue hidden beneath layers of assumptions. The sound returned. Click. This time Ethan immediately knew where it came from. Not the exact component. Not yet. But the general area. Near the center section. Close to an access panel most people seem to ignore. He stared at it quietly. Memory surfaced again. Years ago. Different facility. Different equipment. Similar sound. Similar symptoms. Similar confusion. Ethan took a slow breath. Then another. He still said nothing. He still made no attempt to interrupt the experts. But for the first time all day, he was no longer wondering whether the sound mattered. He was wondering why 40 engineers seemed determined to overlook it. The question stayed with Ethan Carter as the evening stretched deeper into night. Why was everyone ignoring the sound? Around him, the factory had become a battlefield of ideas. Engineers moved from one theory to another. Consultants reviewed diagrams spread across portable tables. Technicians carried testing equipment from station to station. Every person present was intelligent. Every person was qualified. Yet the machine remained silent. Ethan stood near the receiving area drinking coffee from a paper cup someone had handed him hours earlier. The warmth had long disappeared, but he barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the production line. Then the sound came again. Click. A few seconds passed. Click. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Not to think. To listen. Sometimes people focused so hard on data that they stopped paying attention to what the machine itself was trying to say. He opened his eyes and watched the central section of the system. The sound originated there. He was certain of it now, near an access panel that nobody seemed interested in examining. Nearby, two senior engineers debated sensor synchronization. Another group reviewed software timing sequences. A consultant suggested replacing an entire control assembly. Ethan quietly shook his head. The suggestions grew more complicated by the minute. The sound suggested something simpler. Across the production floor, the woman in the dark business suit listened to another status update. One engineer spoke first. "We have eliminated software corruption." Another nodded. "Power distribution is stable." A third added, "Control communication pathways are functioning normally." The woman looked at each of them. "And the machine?" Silence. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one engineer sighed. "Still offline." The frustration was becoming impossible to hide. Ethan understood why. Smart people disliked unsolved problems, especially when the solution seemed close enough to touch but impossible to see. Then something unexpected happened. A senior engineer walked past Ethan carrying a diagnostic tablet. The man looked exhausted. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Can I ask you something?" The engineer barely slowed down. "Depends." Ethan nodded toward the machine. "Has anyone checked whether the relay sequence is completing?" The engineer stopped. For the first time all evening, someone looked at Ethan with curiosity rather than dismissal. "Why would you ask that?" Ethan shrugged. "Just wondering." The engineer studied him carefully. "Do you work in manufacturing?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Not anymore." The answer seemed to create even more questions. Before the engineer could ask them, the sound returned. Click. Ethan looked toward the center section immediately. The engineer followed his gaze. "You hear that?" Ethan nodded. "Every time." For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Then the engineer frowned. "Interesting." It was the first time all day anyone with technical authority had acknowledged the sound mattered. Ethan pointed toward the central access area. "Has anyone opened that panel?" The engineer looked in the same direction. "Several times." Ethan nodded. "Did they inspect the relay housing behind it?" The engineer paused. "Longer this time." "I am not sure." Another silence followed. The engineer glanced at Ethan again. The delivery driver standing in worn work clothes did not fit any profile he expected. Yet there was something calm about him. No arrogance. No attempt to impress. Just quiet confidence. The kind that often came from experience. The engineer looked back toward the machine, then toward the woman leading the operation. Finally he sighed. "Come with me." Ethan blinked. "Me?" "Just for a minute." Several nearby employees noticed as the engineer guided Ethan toward the production area. Curious looks immediately followed. The receiving clerk stared in surprise. A technician raised an eyebrow. Others exchanged puzzled glances. The woman in the dark business suit noticed the movement as well. "What is going on?" she asked. The engineer stopped beside her. This gentleman asked an interesting question. Her eyes moved toward Ethan. Calm. Professional. Curious. And what question was that? Ethan felt dozens of eyes settle on him at once. 40 engineers. Managers. Supervisors. Specialists. Every one of them waiting. He looked toward the silent machine, then back at the woman. His voice remained polite, quiet, respectful. "I was just wondering why everyone keeps treating the clicking sound like a symptom when it might actually be the cause." For a moment, nobody said anything. The factory seemed to hold its breath. Engineers looked at Ethan Carter. Managers looked at Ethan Carter. Even the woman leading the operation studied him carefully. The delivery driver, who had spent most of the afternoon standing quietly near the receiving area, had suddenly become the center of attention. Then a few people smiled. One engineer chuckled softly. Another exchanged an amused glance with a colleague. The reaction spread quickly. Not cruel, not hostile, simply disbelief. "The clicking sound?" one consultant repeated. "That is what we are talking about now." Another engineer folded his arms. "You think 40 engineers somehow ignored the obvious?" Ethan remained calm. "I did not say that." The woman in the dark business suit raised a hand and the room settled. Her voice remained professional. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Ethan looked toward the machine. "Only that the sound seems important." One engineer shook his head immediately. "Everything has already been analyzed." Another nodded. "Extensively." A third pointed towards several diagnostic stations. We have thousands of data points. Ethan listened respectfully, then nodded. I believe you. The answer seemed to surprise them. Most people challenged experts. Ethan never did. He simply acknowledged their effort. The senior engineer who had brought Ethan over stepped forward. To be fair, I am not sure we specifically traced the source of the clicking. Several heads turned toward him. One consultant frowned. Because it is irrelevant. Maybe. The engineer shrugged. Or maybe not. The woman looked between them. The facility had already lost nearly an entire day. Every possibility deserved consideration. Where do you think it is coming from? She asked Ethan. He pointed toward the central section of the production system. Near the access panel he had been watching all evening. Immediately, several engineers exchanged looks. That area has been inspected. Twice. Nothing unusual found. Ethan nodded again. Then perhaps I am wrong. The simplicity of the response caught them off guard. No argument. No attempt to defend himself. No effort to prove anything. Just quiet acceptance. Yet strangely, that made people listen more carefully. One of the senior technicians looked at Ethan. Why does it sound familiar to you? Ethan hesitated. He rarely talked about his past. Not because it was secret, because it no longer felt important. Years ago, I worked around industrial systems. A consultant laughed softly. Years ago? Ethan smiled. A long time ago. Doing what? Ethan looked down briefly. Maintenance. Troubleshooting. Whatever needed doing. The consultant did not seem impressed. This facility uses advanced automated manufacturing technology. Ethan nodded. It does. And you think you can solve a problem that 40 specialists could not? Several nearby engineers smiled. The question hung in the air. Ethan could feel dozens of eyes watching him. Waiting. Judging. Expecting. Yet his answer came easily. No. The consultant blinked. No. Ethan shook his head. I do not think that. The room grew quieter. Ethan continued. I think there is a chance the machine is trying to tell us something. Another brief silence followed. The words sounded simple. Almost too simple. Yet they carried a certain logic. Machines did not become mysterious. They followed rules. Causes created effects. Problems left clues. Somewhere inside the system, something was creating that sound. The woman considered this carefully. Then she looked toward the senior engineer. How long would it take to verify? The engineer glanced toward the access panel. 5 minutes. A consultant immediately objected. We are wasting time. Another nodded. This is not a serious diagnostic strategy. The woman looked at them calmly. And what has the serious strategy accomplished during the last 10 hours? Nobody answered. Silence spread across the production floor. Finally, the senior engineer smiled slightly. That is a fair point. The woman nodded. 5 minutes. Several engineers reluctantly agreed. A technician retrieved tools. Another pulled up system schematics. Employees gathered nearby. Curiosity spread rapidly through the building. Word traveled fast. The delivery driver had suggested something. The experts were actually checking it. Ethan remained where he stood. Calm. Quiet. Unconcerned with attention. One worker approached him. You really think this is it? Ethan looked toward the machine. The clicking sound appeared again. Click. His eyes moved immediately toward the access panel. Then he smiled faintly. I think the machine keeps repeating the same answer. The worker frowned. And nobody is hearing it. Ethan nodded. Something like that. Nearby, the technician reached the access panel and removed the first fastener. The crowd leaned forward. The woman watched carefully. The consultants crossed their arms. The engineers studied the process. And for the first time all day, every person in the factory was looking exactly where Ethan Carter had been looking from the very beginning. The technician removed the final fastener and carefully opened the access panel. Dozens of people watched from across the production floor. Engineers leaned forward. Managers stepped closer. Even employees who barely understood the machine sensed that something important was happening. Ethan Carter remained where he stood. Quiet. Patient. Unconcerned with attention. He simply watched. Inside the panel, rows of components sat neatly arranged behind protective housings. Wiring bundles ran along metal channels. Indicator lights blinked softly. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance. The technician looked back toward the senior engineer. Everything looks normal. Several consultants nodded immediately. One even smiled. There we go. The reaction spread quickly. Some people were already preparing to move on. Yet the clicking sound returned. Click. Every head turned toward the panel. This time the source was obvious. The sound came from somewhere inside the compartment. The technician paused. Interesting. The senior engineer stepped forward. Again. They waited. A few seconds later it happened. Click. The engineer crouched beside the opening. His eyes followed the sound. Then he frowned. Hold on. A consultant folded his arms. What? The engineer pointed toward a small relay housing partially hidden behind a support bracket. That. Several people moved closer. The technician directed a flashlight toward the component. Immediately something became visible. A relay repeatedly attempted to engage. Failed. Reset. Then tried again. Click. Silence spread through the group. Ethan watched without saying a word. The engineer stared at the component. How did we miss that? Nobody answered. The consultant stepped closer. That relay cannot shut down the entire system. The engineer continued studying it. Normally, no. Click. Another failed engagement. Another reset. The engineer's expression changed. Suddenly, the impossible began looking possible. He grabbed a schematic tablet from a nearby workstation and reviewed the system architecture. Several engineers gathered around him. Pages of technical diagrams filled the screen. Then one engineer pointed. Wait. Another looked closer. No way. A third nodded slowly. It is part of the synchronization sequence. The consultant frowned. So. The senior engineer looked up. So if it never completes the sequence. Understanding spread across his face. The entire startup process remains locked. Complete silence followed. The woman in the dark business suit stepped closer. Can it be fixed? The engineer looked toward the relay. Then toward the maintenance technician. Check the mounting assembly. The technician examined it carefully. Seconds later he looked up. You are not going to believe this. The crowd waited. The technician held up a tiny fastening clip, barely larger than a coin. It slipped out of alignment. Nobody spoke. After 10 hours, 40 engineers, consultants from 3 states, endless diagnostics, endless theories, and the problem appeared to involve a component that cost less than a restaurant lunch. The technician carefully repositioned the assembly. The relay settled into place. Then he looked toward the engineer. Ready? The engineer nodded. Try it. The technician made a small adjustment. Nothing dramatic. No complex procedure. No advanced calibration. Just a simple movement. Less than a second. Everyone watched. The relay engaged. Click. This time the sound was different. Firm. Complete. Final. The technician stared at it. The senior engineer stared at it. Then both looked toward the control panel. A sequence of green indicators illuminated almost immediately. One after another. Across the production system, status lights began changing. Yellow became green. Warning messages disappeared. Control screens updated. The giant machine seemed to awaken from a long sleep. Conveyor sections activated. Motors began turning. Sensors initialized. Automated stations came online throughout the facility. The production line started moving. For a moment, nobody reacted. They simply watched. The machine that had defeated 40 engineers all day long was operating again. The factory floor filled with movement. Equipment resumed normal operation. Data screens reported healthy status. Employees looked around in disbelief. Then came the silence. Not confusion. Not frustration. Silence born from astonishment. Hundreds of people stood motionless. The machine was running. The problem was solved. And everyone knew exactly when everything had changed. The woman slowly turned toward Ethan. The engineers followed. The consultants followed. The technicians followed. Every eye in the building settled on the single father standing quietly near the edge of the crowd. Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Looks like you found it, he said. The senior engineer laughed softly. No. He shook his head. You found it. Another silence followed. The production line continued operating behind them. Green lights reflected across the factory floor. Machines hummed steadily. Contracts were saved. Schedules were restored. Millions of dollars in losses had been prevented. Yet nobody seemed interested in celebrating. Because a far more remarkable realization was spreading through the building. 40 experts had spent 10 hours searching for an answer. Ethan Carter had listened to a sound for 10 seconds. For several seconds after the production line restarted, nobody moved. The massive system hummed steadily as if nothing had ever been wrong. Conveyor belts rolled. Sensors flashed green. Automated stations resumed their synchronized routines. Yet the people standing around the machine seemed frozen in place. The silence was unlike anything Ethan Carter had experienced. It was not awkward. It was not uncomfortable. It was the sound of certainty colliding with surprise. 40 engineers had spent the day searching for answers. A single father delivering replacement parts had noticed a sound everyone else ignored. The reality of that fact settled over the factory floor like a sudden change in weather. The senior engineer was the first to speak. I still cannot believe it. Several others nodded immediately. One consultant stared at the relay housing as though expecting it to reveal another secret. A technician shook his head and laughed softly. 10 hours. Nobody disagreed. The woman in the dark business suit stepped toward Ethan. Up close, her calm professionalism seemed even more apparent. She extended her hand. I never properly introduced myself. Ethan shook it politely. Ethan Carter. Rebecca Lawson. Her expression was sincere. And on behalf of everyone here, thank you. Ethan smiled. You do not need to thank me. Several people nearby exchanged amused looks. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. I think we do. Ethan glanced toward the machine. The engineers fixed it. The senior engineer immediately laughed. That is generous. Another engineer nodded. Very generous. Rebecca looked at Ethan carefully. Most people would be taking credit right now. Ethan shrugged. The machine was already telling us what was wrong. The statement caused another moment of silence. Because deep down, everyone knew exactly what he meant. The evidence had been there all along. The sound, the pattern, the clue hiding in plain sight. The problem was not a lack of information. It was where people chose to look. Nearby employees continued gathering around. Word had spread throughout the facility. Workers from departments that had never even seen the original failure now arrived asking questions. Every version of the story sounded slightly different. Yet all of them ended the same way. The delivery driver noticed something nobody else did. One employee approached Ethan. How did you know? Ethan smiled. I did not. The worker frowned. But you found it. I suspected it. The distinction mattered to him. Good troubleshooting rarely began with certainty. It began with curiosity. Another employee asked, Were you an engineer? Ethan hesitated briefly. A long time ago. Several nearby heads turned immediately. Rebecca noticed. A long time ago. Ethan nodded. Years ago. Where? Another engineer asked. Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable with the growing attention. Different places. The answer only increased curiosity. The senior engineer crossed his arms. You are being very mysterious. Ethan laughed softly. Not intentionally. Rebecca studied him carefully. Something about his calmness stood out. Most people who solved a problem like this would be celebrating, retelling the story, enjoying the spotlight. Ethan seemed eager to return home. That alone made him interesting. Then one of the consultants stepped forward. He had been among the most skeptical voices earlier. I owe you an apology. The factory grew quiet again. The consultant extended his hand. I dismissed your suggestion. Ethan shook it immediately. That is all right. No. The consultant smiled. It is not. Several engineers nodded. Respect had replaced skepticism. Not because Ethan embarrassed anyone. Not because he proved people wrong. Because he remained respectful even when others overlooked him. Quiet confidence often carried more weight than loud expertise. Rebecca looked toward the clock mounted on the far wall. The production line had been operational again for nearly 20 minutes. Every indicator remained healthy. The crisis was over. Yet she found herself more interested in Ethan than the machine. Mr. Carter, she said, I would like to ask you a question. Ethan nodded. Of course. Rebecca folded her arms thoughtfully. If you noticed the clue almost immediately, why did you wait so long before saying anything? The answer came without hesitation. Because 40 engineers were already working on it. Rebecca looked surprised. Ethan continued. Smart people deserve time to do their jobs. The response left the room silent once again. Not because it was technical. Not because it was impressive. Because it revealed something deeper. Humility. Grace. Respect. Qualities far rarer than expertise. Rebecca slowly smiled. You know, Mr. Carter, I think that answer tells me more about you than fixing the machine ever could. Around them, the factory continued humming steadily into the night. Production was restored. Contracts were saved. A costly shutdown had ended. Yet the real conversation had only begun. Because now everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who exactly was Ethan Carter? And how had a single father delivering parts managed to see what an entire room full of experts could not? The question spread through the factory faster than any official report. Who exactly was Ethan Carter? Employees whispered about it while monitoring production lines. Engineers discussed it beside diagnostic stations. Supervisors repeated theories that grew more dramatic with every retelling. Some believed he had worked for a major technology company. Others suspected he had once designed industrial systems. One worker claimed Ethan must secretly own patents. The truth, however, was much quieter. Rebecca Lawson eventually invited Ethan into a small conference room overlooking the production floor. Through the glass walls, they could see the massive machine operating normally again. Green indicators glowed steadily. Conveyor systems moved without interruption. The crisis that had dominated the entire day was finally over. Rebecca sat across from Ethan while the senior engineer joined them. Fresh coffee waited on the table. For the first time since arriving that morning, Ethan actually sat down. "I hope you do not mind a few questions," Rebecca said. Ethan smiled politely. "Not at all." The senior engineer leaned forward. "Where did you learn troubleshooting like that?" Ethan looked toward the production floor before answering. "Experience." The engineer laughed softly. "That is not a complete answer." Ethan smiled. "It is the honest one." Rebecca noticed the humility immediately. He never exaggerated. Never tried to sound impressive. Every answer seemed smaller than the achievement everyone had witnessed. "You mentioned working around industrial systems years ago," she said. Ethan nodded. "That is right. Doing maintenance. Among other things." The senior engineer shook his head. "Nobody develops instincts like yours from routine maintenance alone." Ethan remained quiet for a moment. Finally, he sighed. "Before my daughter was born, I worked as a systems engineer." The room became still. Rebecca exchanged a glance with the senior engineer. Suddenly, several pieces of the puzzle began fitting together. "For whom?" she asked. Ethan mentioned the name of a respected industrial automation company. Both listeners immediately recognized it. The company was known throughout the industry for solving difficult engineering problems. "You worked there?" the engineer asked. Ethan nodded. "For several years." "What position?" Ethan hesitated. "Lead diagnostics specialist." Silence followed. The engineer leaned back slowly. Rebecca stared at him. Even among experts, that role carried significant respect. It was the type of position assigned to people trusted with the most difficult problems. "Why did you leave?" Rebecca finally asked. Ethan smiled gently. The answer came without bitterness. Life changed. He removed his phone and showed a photograph. A teenage girl smiling beside an old pickup truck. "My daughter." Rebecca smiled immediately. "She looks happy." "She is." Ethan's expression softened. "After her mother passed away, I wanted to be present." The room fell quiet again. Not awkwardly. Respectfully. Ethan continued. "The travel became difficult. The hours became difficult. I had to choose what mattered most." Rebecca nodded slowly. The answer explained everything. Not only why he left, why he carried himself the way he did, why recognition seemed unimportant to him, why he never argued with anyone despite being right. His priorities had shifted long ago. The senior engineer looked down briefly. "You gave up a remarkable career." Ethan smiled. "I gained a remarkable daughter." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Through the conference room glass, workers continued moving across the factory floor. Machines operated normally. Production targets were being recovered. Yet the conversation inside the room suddenly felt far more important than the machine itself. Rebecca looked at Ethan thoughtfully. "You know, most people would tell that story differently." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Most people would describe what they sacrificed." Ethan glanced at the photograph again, then smiled. "I never saw it as a sacrifice." The answer stayed with both listeners. Quiet. Simple. Powerful. The senior engineer laughed softly. "You really are impossible." Ethan looked confused. "Why?" The engineer smiled. "Because every answer somehow makes you more impressive while you are actively trying not to be." Even Ethan laughed at that. Outside the conference room, word continued spreading. Employees learned that the quiet delivery driver had once been one of the most respected troubleshooting specialists in his field. Yet strangely, the discovery did not change how people felt about him. It deepened their respect. Because the most remarkable part was not who Ethan Carter used to be. It was who he chose to become. By the time Ethan Carter finally left the factory, the Arizona sky had turned deep blue. The last traces of sunlight lingered beyond the horizon, while the production facility, behind him, continued operating at full capacity. Trucks moved through loading lanes. Employees returned to normal schedules. The crisis that had threatened an entire day of work now felt like a distant memory. Yet for many people inside that building, the memory would remain for years. Rebecca Lawson walked with Ethan toward the parking lot. The evening air felt cooler now, quieter. The noise of the factory faded behind them. "I appreciate everything you did today," she said. Ethan smiled. "I'm glad things worked out." Rebecca laughed softly. "That sounds like someone describing a successful grocery trip, not saving a multi-million-dollar production line." Ethan shrugged. "The machine is running. That is what matters." Rebecca stopped beside his pickup truck. The aging vehicle sat beneath a parking lot light, worn but carefully maintained. Somehow it suited him perfectly. "Would you ever consider coming back to engineering?" she asked. Ethan looked at the truck for a moment before answering. "I never really left engineering." Rebecca appeared confused. Ethan smiled. "I just stopped making it my job." The answer made her smile. Quiet wisdom seemed to follow him everywhere. Before leaving, she handed him a business card. "If you ever need anything, call me." Ethan accepted it politely. "Thank you. I am serious." Rebecca paused. "People spend entire careers trying to develop instincts like yours." Ethan glanced at the photograph of his daughter displayed on his phone screen. "I already have the career I want." Rebecca followed his gaze and understood immediately. Some successes could not be measured by job titles or salaries. Some victories happened around dinner tables. Some achievements rode home in old pickup trucks. She extended her hand one final time. Ethan shook it. Then he climbed into the driver's seat and headed home. 40 minutes later, he pulled into the driveway of a modest house on a quiet street. Warm light glowed through the front windows. Before he even reached the porch, the front door opened. His daughter stepped outside smiling. "You are late." Ethan laughed. "A little. Long day. Long day." She looked at him carefully. "Everything okay?" Ethan nodded. "Everything is perfect." Inside the house, dinner waited on the table. Simple food, comfortable conversation, familiar laughter. No reporters, no headlines, no celebrations, just the life he had chosen. As they ate, his daughter talked about school, friends, and plans for the weekend. Ethan listened closely to every word. Completely present, completely content. The factory, the engineers, the machine, all of it felt far away now. Later that night, after the dishes were finished and the house had grown quiet, Ethan sat on the back porch watching the stars appear above the desert sky. The world often celebrated loud victories, big promotions, public recognition, impressive titles. Yet some of the most meaningful victories happened quietly. A father making it home for dinner. A daughter who knew she was loved. A life built on dignity instead of applause. The next morning, employees arriving at the factory would still be talking about the delivery driver who solved the problem nobody else could solve. Engineers would remember the lesson. Managers would remember the humility. Rebecca Lawson would remember the man who never asked for credit. But Ethan Carter would simply wake up, make breakfast, and continue living the life he valued most. Because the truth was never about fixing a machine. It was about something far greater. Expertise earns admiration. Character earns respect. And while 40 engineers spent a day searching for answers, the single father never needed recognition to know his worth. In the end, the factory regained production. The experts gained perspective. And a quiet man returned home to the people who mattered most. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the loudest voice. Sometimes it is the one who listens. If this story reminded you that dignity, humility, and quiet confidence still matter, share your thoughts below. And if stories about respect, second chances, and ordinary people revealing extraordinary characters speak to your heart, consider joining us for more journeys like this one.